The weight of the porcelain plate in my hands felt like a leaden weight, pressing down on my palms until they throbbed. My husband, Mark, didn't even look up from the wine he was pouring, the vintage Bordeaux I had bought to celebrate my latest promotion, as he gestured vaguely toward the swinging door of the kitchen. "Take your plate in there, Elena," he said, his voice as casual as if he were asking me to pass the salt. "There's no room for you at the table tonight, and my sisters need to discuss the family estate in private. You'll be more comfortable on the stool by the counter anyway." The silence that followed was punctured only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. A clock my grandfather had given to me, sitting in a house I had paid for with 10 years of 60-hour work weeks. Behind Mark, his sisters, Lydia and Clara, sat draped over my velvet chairs like visiting royalty, their eyes gleaming with a predatory sort of satisfaction as they waited for me to obey. They weren't just taking my seat. They were colonizing my life. And for the first time, I realized that the man I had shared a bed with for 7 years was the one holding the door open for them. It hadn't always been this way. Or perhaps I had simply been too blinded by the soft glow of my own success to see the shadows lengthening in the corners of my home. When I first bought the Willows, a sprawling, weathered Victorian on the edge of the city, I saw it as a sanctuary. I remember the smell of sawdust and old wax that greeted me on the day I signed the deed. It was a ruin then, with peeling wallpaper and drafty windows, but I had a vision. I spent 3 years and every spare cent I had restoring it. I sanded the mahogany floors until my knees bled. I hand-polished the brass fixtures until they shone like gold. Mark had been there, of course, offering creative input and sketching designs that were often too expensive or impractical to implement. But he was my partner. I loved him. And in my mind, my success was our success. Our life together was built on a series of carefully constructed rituals. Every Saturday morning, we would grind fresh coffee beans, the nutty aroma filling the high-ceilinged kitchen, and discuss our dreams. Mark was an architect, or at least he had been until a creative drought turned into a 3-year hiatus. I didn't mind being the breadwinner. I ran a successful interior design firm, and I took pride in providing a life of comfort and elegance for us. I liked the way he looked in the expensive cashmere sweaters I bought him, the way he seemed to belong in the refined atmosphere I had created. The first hints of rot began with his mother, Beatrice. She was a woman of faded aristocracy, a phrase she used to describe the fact that her family had lost their fortune 3 generations ago, but kept the haughty attitudes. She lived in a cramped, humid apartment filled with doilies and resentment. Whenever she visited, she would run a gloved finger over my consoles, looking for dust that wasn't there. "It's a lovely house, Elena," she would say, her voice thin and sharp like a razor blade hidden in silk. A bit nouveau riche, perhaps? But then again, one can't expect a girl from your background to understand the quiet dignity of ancestral homes. It's a shame this property isn't in the family name. It feels so temporary this way. I used to laugh it off. I thought it was just the bitterness of a woman who had seen better days. I didn't realize that Beatrice was planting seeds and that Mark was the fertile soil. Then came the sisters. Lydia and Clara had always been professional victims. Lydia was between jobs for most of her 30s, while Clara was perpetually recovering from a series of artistic burnout episodes. When their landlord finally evicted them from their shared apartment 6 months ago, Mark came to me with tears in his eyes. "They have nowhere to go, Elle," he had whispered, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "Just for a few weeks? Until they get back on their feet? The Willows is so big we won't even notice they're here." I agreed, because I loved him, and I had a surplus of space and kindness. But the weeks turned into months, and the guests became occupiers. They didn't just occupy the guest rooms, they occupied the atmosphere. They left damp towels on the antique vanities. They drank the expensive wine I kept for clients. They spoke over me at my own dinner table. Slowly, the dynamic shifted. Mark stopped thanking me for the meals I cooked or the bills I paid. Instead, he began to act as if he were the master of a manor, and I was a particularly efficient housekeeper. He started using "we" when talking about my assets. "We're thinking of remodeling the sunroom," he would tell his sisters, never having consulted me. The warmth I used to feel when I walked through my front door began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I started noticing things, small, nagging inconsistencies, a missing piece of jewelry here, a bank statement that had been opened and poorly resealed there. My sisters-in-law began asking pointed questions about the property taxes and whether the house was held in a trust. You know, Elena, Lydia had said one afternoon, her voice dripping with mock concern while she lounged by the pool I had installed the previous summer. It's so much responsibility for one person. Mark is so worried about you. He thinks you're stressed. He mentioned that it might be easier if the house was managed by a family board. You know, to take the pressure off. I had laughed then, a sharp, genuine sound of disbelief. A family board? Lydia, I bought this house. I pay the mortgage. There is no family involvement in my private property. She hadn't smiled back. She had just looked at me with a cold, glassy stare that should have told me everything I needed to know. She looked at me not as a sister-in-law, but as an obstacle. That was a week ago. And now, here I was, standing in the glow of the chandelier I had imported from Murano, being told by the man I loved to go eat in the kitchen like a servant because the family needed to talk. The air in the room felt thick, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by the three women sitting at my table. I looked at Mark, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to wink and tell me it was a joke. But his gaze was fixed on the wine bottle, his jaw set in a hard, stubborn line I had never seen before. He wasn't joking. He was executing a takeover. I didn't move. I stood there, the porcelain plate warm against my fingers, watching the light from the chandelier sparkle in the wine Mark was pouring for his sisters. Lydia reached out, her long manicured nails clicking against the glass, and took a sip with a smug little sigh. She didn't even look at me. It was as if I had already become a ghost in my own dining room. Elena, did you hear me? Mark's voice had a new edge to it, a sharp, impatient tone that made my skin crawl. We have a lot to get through. Just give us an hour. I turned without a word and walked into the kitchen. I didn't sit on the stool. I stood by the sink, staring at the reflection of the darkened garden in the window. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were unnervingly still. I didn't eat. I listened. From the dining room, the muffled sounds of their voices rose and fell like a distant storm. I heard the word appraisal. I heard Beatrice's shrill, aristocratic laugh. I heard Mark say, "She won't be a problem. I've handled the paperwork." That night, Mark didn't come to bed until long after I had pretended to be asleep. He moved through the room with a heavy, deliberate silence. In the days that followed, the early warning signs I had been ignoring for months suddenly transformed into a loud, screaming siren. He started taking private calls in the garage, pacing back and forth behind the glass doors. Whenever I entered a room, the conversation between him and his sisters would die instantly, replaced by a forced, oily cheerfulness. My mail began to go missing. Specifically the bank statements and the property tax notices that usually sat in a neat pile on the entryway table. When I asked him about it, he just sighed, a sound of weary condescension. "You're so stressed lately, Elle," he told me, leaning against the kitchen island while I brewed coffee. "I noticed you were falling behind on the admin stuff, so I just moved it all to my study. I'm taking care of it. You should focus on your clients. You've been so forgetful lately." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Forgetful? I was a woman who managed million-dollar renovation projects with 100 moving parts. I didn't forget my own mortgage statements. But Mark was good. He was gentle. He would touch my shoulder, his eyes full of a calculated pity, and suggest I take a long break or perhaps see a doctor about my anxiety. It was classic gaslighting, delivered with a kiss on the forehead. The atmosphere in the Willows became suffocating. Beatrice started bringing over fabric swatches, heavy, somber damasks that looked like they belonged in a funeral parlor. She would hold them up against my airy linen curtains and tisk. "When the transition is complete," she said one afternoon, not realizing I was standing in the doorway, "we'll have to strip all this modern nonsense out. It lacks gravitas. This house needs to reflect the stature of our family name, not some designer's whim. I felt a surge of cold fury, but I kept it under wraps. I needed to see their hand before I played mine. The point of no return came on a Tuesday. Mark was out at a consultation, a job I knew didn't exist because his firm had been defunct for years. And the sisters were at a spa, paid for, naturally, with our joint credit card. The house was silent, but it didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a trap. I went into Mark's study. It was a room I rarely entered out of a misplaced sense of respect for his creative space. The air inside was stale, smelling of old coffee and tobacco. I began to look. Not just a casual glance, but a systematic search. I went through his desk drawers, his filing cabinet, his trash can. Then I saw it. Tucked behind a row of thick architectural journals was a sleek black leather folder I had never seen before. When I opened it, the world didn't just slow down. It seemed to fracture. My vision blurred for a second, a high-pitched ringing filling my ears as I stared at the document on top. It was a quitclaim deed. My breath hitched in my throat, a sharp, jagged sound. The document was an official transfer of ownership for the Willows. It stated that I, Elena Vance, was voluntarily transferring the title of the property to the Sterling Family Trust, with Mark Sterling and Beatrice Sterling listed as the primary trustees. But it was the bottom of the page that made my stomach turn over in a violent, nauseating flip. There was my signature, bold, fluid, and utterly familiar. Except I had never seen this paper in my life. I sank into his leather chair, my legs suddenly turning to water. I traced the ink of my name with a trembling finger. He had spent weeks practicing it. I remembered seeing scraps of paper in the kitchen trash with my initials scribbled over and over, and I had thought he was just doodling while we talked. He hadn't just been doodling. He had been forging my life away. Beneath the deed was an even more devastating blow. A pre-approved loan application for a massive equity withdrawal against the house. Nearly $400,000. The purpose listed was family business expansion. I felt a wave of cold, crystalline clarity wash over me. The family estate they were discussing at my table wasn't some distant inheritance. It was my house. They weren't just guests. They were scavengers, and Mark was the one who had invited them to the feast. I heard the front door click open. The shrill, melodic laughter of Lydia and Clara drifted up the stairs, followed by the heavy tread of Mark's boots. "Elena, are you home?" he called out, his voice smooth and deceptive. I looked down at the forged signature one last time. The woman who had bought this house, who had bled for these floors and dreamed under this roof, felt like she was dying. But in her place, something else was waking up. Something cold, something sharp, and something very, very dangerous. I carefully closed the folder, slid it back behind the journals, and wiped my eyes. I didn't have time to cry. I had a war to win. I walked down the stairs, my feet feeling strangely light, as if I were floating above the polished mahogany I had once loved so much. My heart was a drum in the hollow of my chest, each beat echoing the name of the document I had just seen. Quitclaim deed. The betrayal was so absolute it felt like a physical weight, a cold, oily film coating my lungs. I walked into the dining room where the three of them were sitting, the remains of a lavish takeout meal strewn across the table. Mark looked up, a flickering shadow of guilt crossing his face before he masked it with that practiced, weary smile. "There you are, Elle. You missed the announcement. Mom is going to be moving into the South Wing starting Friday. It just makes sense, doesn't it? Since we're consolidating." Beatrice didn't even look up from her glass of wine. "The light in the guest suite is far too harsh," she remarked to the room at large. "We'll need to repaint it a soft cream before the movers arrive. And Elena, dear, those exercise machines in the sunroom will have to go. I've decided that will be my morning tea parlor." The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was the spark that hit the gasoline in my veins. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I simply sat down in the chair at the head of the table, my chair, and looked at Mark. "Consolidating," I repeated, my voice steady. though I could feel the tremors starting in my hands under the table. That's an interesting word for it, Mark. Does consolidating usually involve forging your wife's signature on a deed to her own house? The silence that followed was so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Mark's glass hit the table with a dull thud, some of the red wine slopping over the rim and staining the white linen. His face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, his eyes darting toward the study. The black leather folder, Mark. Behind the journals. I leaned forward, my gaze locked on his. The Sterling Family Trust. The $400,000 loan application. How long were you planning to wait before you told me I was a tenant in my own home? Or were you just going to wait until I woke up one morning and found the locks changed? Elena, listen. Mark started, his voice cracking. He reached out to touch my arm, but I flinched away as if he were a viper. It's not what it looks like. We were in trouble. Lydia's things happened, and Mom's apartment lease was up, and I thought, you thought you could steal from me? I cut him off, the coldness in my voice surprising even me. You thought you could practice my signature until you could mimic it perfectly and hand over 10 years of my life to your mother and sisters? It's family property now, Elena. Beatrice interrupted, her voice sharp and devoid of its usual faux warmth. She set her glass down and stared at me with cold, reptilian eyes. You should be honored to contribute to the Sterling legacy. Mark is the head of this family, and it was his right to ensure our security. You've always been so territorial about money. It's quite vulgar, really. His right? I turned to her, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. I bought this house with my money. I paid for his clothes, his car, and your spa days. There is no Sterling legacy here, Beatrice. There is only my hard work and your parasitic greed. Lydia chimed in then, her voice dripping with malice. Oh, please. You've had it easy, Elena. With your fancy little business. Did you really think Mark was just consulting all those months he was out? He was setting up the new firm, the one that's going to take over your client list. Tell her, Mark. I felt the ground shift beneath me. My client list? I looked at Mark, who was now staring intently at his hands, refusing to meet my eyes. Mark, what is she talking about? He remained silent. The silence of the husband was a deafening roar in the room. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't defend me. He just sat there, his shoulders hunched, looking like a small broken boy instead of the man I had loved. He's been copying your files for months, Clara added, a cruel smirk on her face. Every contact, every contract, every vendor list. He's already reached out to the Miller account and the Sterling Holloway group. He told them you were retiring due to mental health issues. They've already signed letters of intent with him. The physical shock hit me then, a wave of nausea so strong I had to grip the edge of the table. It wasn't just the house. They were stripping my professional life bare, too. They were systematic. They were thorough. They were destroying me from the inside out. Mark, look at me, I whispered, my voice trembling now. Tell me it's not true. Tell me you didn't tell my clients I was losing my mind so you could steal my business. He still didn't look up. We needed a fresh start, Elle. He muttered to the tablecloth. You were always so busy. You never had time for us. I needed to build something of my own. By stealing mine? I stood up, the chair screeching against the floor. You didn't build anything. You're a thief. You're all thieves. Be careful, Elena, Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. The paperwork is already filed. The deed is recorded. The loan has been initiated. Technically, you're a guest here now. And if you continue to make these accusations, we might have to ask you to leave tonight. And we'll make sure everyone in this town knows exactly why you broke down. I looked at the three of them. The husband who had sold my soul for a chance to feel powerful, and the women who had propped up his ego while they picked my pockets. The fury that had been burning white-hot suddenly turned into something else. Something icy. Something calculating. You think you've won, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to carry more weight than a scream. You think you've thought of everything? We have, Lydia snapped. Now, why don't you go to the kitchen and make us some tea? We have a lot more family business to discuss. I looked at Mark one last time. He finally looked up, and for a second I saw a flash of the man I used to know. A man who looked terrified of what he had become. But then he looked at his mother and the shutters went back down. He stayed silent. Fine, I said, my voice as cold as a winter grave. You want the house? You want the business? Let's see how much they're worth when I'm done with you. I walked out of the room, their laughter following me like the sound of breaking glass. They thought I was going to my room to cry. They thought I was defeated. They didn't realize that I hadn't just built houses. I had built a network, and I knew exactly which pillars to pull down to make the whole ceiling collapse on their heads. The laughter from the dining room felt like shards of glass scraping against my nerves. I stood in the dark hallway, my hand resting on the banister I had polished myself, and I felt it. The click. It was as if a fever had suddenly broken, leaving me with a cold, terrifying clarity. The woman who had loved Mark, who had nurtured his fragile ego and sheltered his family, was gone. In her place was someone who understood exactly what needed to be done. I didn't go to my bedroom to pack. I went to my office and locked the door. My first call was to Marcus, a man who had been my father's closest friend and a top-tier forensic accountant. I didn't cry when he picked up. My voice was as level as a horizon. Marcus, I said, I need you to look into something. My husband forged a deed to my house and is attempting to secure a loan against it. I also suspect he's been committing corporate espionage against my firm. Elena? Marcus's voice was gruff with concern. Are you safe? I'm in the house, I replied, looking at the security monitor on my desk. And I have exactly what I need to make sure they never set foot in it again. I had forgotten about the nanny cam I'd installed 6 months ago when Lydia's expensive habits first started resulting in my jewelry going missing. I had tucked it inside a vintage camera on the bookshelf in the study. I opened the app on my laptop, my fingers flying across the keys. I scrolled back through the weeks, and there it was. High-definition footage of Mark sitting at his desk, my passport open beside him, practicing my signature on sheet after sheet of paper until he perfected the slant of the E. I watched him show the final document to Beatrice, who patted his hand with a sickeningly proud smile. I downloaded every second of it. Then I spent the rest of the night systematically revoking every access Mark had to my life. I froze our joint accounts, which were funded entirely by me. I changed the passwords to my firm's servers and sent a mass email to my clients from a private, encrypted address, informing them that my husband was no longer affiliated with the business and that any communications from him were part of a fraudulent scheme currently under police investigation. The retribution didn't happen in a scream. It happened in a series of quiet, devastating strikes. On Friday morning, the day Beatrice was supposed to move in, I was in the kitchen, calmly making tea. The sisters were already there, Lydia measuring the windows for new curtains while Clara scrolled through high-end furniture sites on her tablet. The movers will be here at 10, Elena, Beatrice said, sweeping into the room in a silk caftan. I assume your things are already in the garage? Actually, Beatrice, I said, taking a slow sip of my tea. There's been a change of plans. Mark walked in then, looking smug until he saw the 3 men standing in the foyer behind me. One was Marcus, and the other 2 were detectives from the white-collar crime division. Mark's face went the color of curdled milk. What is this? He stammered, his eyes darting toward the study. This is the end of the Sterling legacy, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. I turned the laptop around on the counter. The video began to play. Mark hunched over the desk, forging my name. The sound was crystal clear. Beatrice saying, once the loan clears, we'll put her in that sanitarium upstate for a rest and take full control. Lydia let out a small, strangled gasp. Clara dropped her tablet. That's a private recording, Mark yelled, his voice cracking. It's not admissible. In a criminal fraud investigation? It very much is, the lead detective said, stepping forward. Mark Sterling, you're under arrest for forgery, identity theft, and attempted bank fraud. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the physical reality of the moment seemed to shatter the sisters' composure. Wait, Lydia shrieked. You can't do this. We have nowhere to go. The house is in the trust. The trust was built on a forged deed, Lydia, Marcus said, his voice dripping with disdain. The bank has already been notified. Not only is the loan canceled, but the bank is filing its own charges for the fraudulent application. I walked over to Mark, who was now trembling, his head hanging low. I didn't feel pity. I didn't even feel anger anymore. Just a profound, cleansing sense of relief. You told your mother I was vulgar for being territorial about my money, I said, leaning in so only he could hear me. But you were more than happy to live off it for 7 years. You thought I was weak because I was kind. That was your biggest mistake. Elle, please, he whispered, finally looking at me. I did it for us. For our future. There is no us, Mark. There is only a thief and his victim, and the victim just finished her counterattack. I watched as they led him out to the squad car. Then I turned to Beatrice and the sisters. You have 20 minutes to gather your things. Whatever is left after that goes into the industrial shredder I've hired for the afternoon. You can't throw us out, Beatrice hissed, though her eyes were wide with terror. I'm an old woman. Then I suggest you find a very comfortable park bench, I said, because the only thing you're inheriting today, Beatrice, is a court date for conspiracy. 6 months later, the Willows was finally silent. I sat on the veranda, the same place where I had once felt like a ghost, and watched the sun set over the garden. The heavy damask curtains Beatrice had wanted were never installed. Instead, the house was filled with light and the scent of fresh jasmine. The legal battle had been grueling, but decisive. Mark was serving 3 years. His sisters were living in a studio apartment, working first real jobs they'd had in a decade to pay back the credit card debt I'd successfully sued them for. My business had not only survived, but thrived. My clients had been horrified by Mark's betrayal and had rallied around me with a loyalty that humbled me. I picked up my coffee cup, the ceramic warm against my palms, and took a deep breath of the cool evening air. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I had rebuilt more than just a house. I had rebuilt a life that no one could ever take from me again. Betrayal is a fire that either consumes you or forges you into something unbreakable. As I looked out at the home I had saved, I knew which one I had become. Some people think a house is made of walls and beams. I know now it's made of the strength of the person who stands within them, and my foundation has never been stronger.